So, you know, Lincoln is getting a lot of press lately, obviously, with the movie, etc. But you could, and I know a lot of people argue that what he did was about improving us. I mean, that was, in a way, a social experiment, and that was a lot of federal power getting pushed around. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of nuances to that, but that was the federal power being pushed on a lot of people who didn't, you know, they didn't want to be improved. So how do you reconcile that?
Well, Lincoln was very acutely, even painfully aware of the dilemma that slavery was a great evil in a country dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. It was a flagrant contradiction of our basic ideals. But that very little could be done about it directly and constitutionally. And so, you know, what strikes me about Lincoln's career is how delicately his statecraft moved forward. I mean, if you look at the great documents of his administration, I mean, his great papers, not just the Emancipation Proclamation, but that's not a bad example. I mean, he bends over backwards to justify everything he tries to do by some clause of the Constitution and an overall interpretation of the Constitution's principles and goal. I mean, the Emancipation Proclamation is the most striking because he realized he had no power to do anything about slavery in the country directly as president, except in the emergency of war as a war measure. And so, you know, the most, I forget who said it, Richard Hofstadter or someone said that the Emancipation Proclamation has all of the romance and idealism of a bill of lading. And that's because he was at great pains to say the only slaves he was freeing were those behind enemy lines in order to weaken the Southern resistance to the Union. He did not free any slaves in the North. He did not free slaves in the border states. He did not free slaves that were in Union custody already. And so it was it was narrowly tailored, as the lawyers say, and it was, you know, constitutionally justified. And remember, he gave them 3 months. He issued first a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, and then 3 months later the final one, because he wanted to give the Southern states time to reverse themselves and return to the Union and not have their slaves freed if they rejoined the Union cause. So, I mean, it is true that, especially at the beginning of the war, he took sweeping and to some extent unprecedented measures to defend the Union. But he thought that was necessary and constitutional in the broader sense. You don't see, I mean, anything like that respect for the Constitution and for democracy, I think, in, you know, the arguments of modern liberalism. Because the whole idea of the living Constitution is really that, you know, the Constitution is what's happening now. And we can't be constrained by the dead hand of the past. That would be reactionary.
Yes, Professor, you inspired me a bit when you, I'm going to paraphrase because I don't write as fast as you were talking, but...
I've heard this from my students.
Yeah, I like that because, you know, I teach as well, kids.
Sure.
And, you know, you talked about the Constitution sort of being the epicenter or the center of all of our politics. And I like that because my question, I don't know how exactly I should ask this, but, well, let's put it this way. As Lincoln, kind of piggybacking from the Lincoln talk, it seemed that Lincoln talked a lot about the Declaration. And, you know, I don't hear a lot today, especially by Republicans, even conservatives, talking much or mentioning the principles of the Declaration of Independence as a way to understand the Constitution. Because, you see, we just talk about, if we just leave it as a Constitution, I'm wondering if there is a moral basis that we can look to, like natural law and all of the years of understanding of natural law, And see, we have kind of rejected and forgotten that whole aspect of it. Even our law books was based on it. And it leads to this part of the question is, you know, gay marriage is about to be heard in the Supreme Court. So I'm just wondering, now that the Supreme Court is going to snatch away from the states the whole authority, you know, of making a decision, I'm wondering where, you know, what could possibly happen. I mean, is the whole country now going to be forced to say that gay marriage is constitutional if they now say that?
Well, there are two different questions there, I think.
Yes.
Look, Lincoln is a great model for Republicans on the relation between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And this is actually one of the specialties of the Claremont Institute and the CRB. We talk about this all the time. Lincoln said that the relation of the Declaration to the Constitution is the relation of apples of gold to pictures of silver. This is something from the Bible. I mean, the Constitution was made to bring to life the principles of the Declaration of Independence. And those principles suffuse the understanding of the Constitution, even though there were, for example, the famous or the notorious compromises with slavery that went into the document, into the Constitution. They were regarded as the price that had to be paid to get a union that would, for the first time in a major country in many centuries, have a Republican government dedicated ultimately to the freedom of everyone. It was, as Lincoln explained it, the founders understood the evil of slavery, and I think he's absolutely right about that. But they thought they had put it in the course of ultimate extinction. And in a way, they had until the 1820s and the 1830s when things went wrong. But if you look at the America from 1776 to the 1820s, what you see is a wave of emancipation proceeding from the north all the way down to the Mason-Dixon line. I mean, at one point, slavery was legal in Massachusetts, in Pennsylvania, in New York, in all the colonies. By the 1820s, it had been abolished in all of those northern colonies, or states now, right down to Virginia and Maryland. And most of the founders, this is part of Lincoln's argument, thought that that wave of emancipation would continue over the next generation. But about that, they were wrong. It stopped at the Mason-Dixon line. And so the whole problem of slavery then took on a different aspect, because what had seemed inevitable, or virtually inevitable in the founding, that this contradiction, this horrible institution would gradually be eliminated, suddenly seemed not at all inevitable. But it was going to be a political fight. And that's, the beginning of the Civil War really is in the developments of the 1820s and 1830s. Now, about gay marriage, I guess there are probably different opinions about gay marriage, but it's certainly, we have a piece in the next issue of the Claremont Review which says that in 10 years, gay marriage went from being a joke to being a dogma. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, because gay rights used to be about liberation, but nowadays gay rights, R-I-T-E-S, is about commitment and stability and the opposite of liberation, that is marriage, which represents either the domestication of gay rights or a strange, imitation of the heterosexual world, an attempt to approximate somehow that to the heterosexual world. But as a legal matter, I mean, the court almost had to take this case because it involves such extraordinary circumstances. I mean, a constitutional amendment to the California Constitution that would not be defended by the state government. And so private parties had to defend it, and you know, it had the Supremes written all over it. It has to go up to them, I'm afraid. Who knows what they will rule? Probably 5-4. One way or the other. Yes, sir.
I read your book, and I really appreciate all the work you put into that. It's really wonderful.
Thank you.
And it portrays a progression, a progressiveness of taking over institutions and bringing people into the fold and holding out to them various kinds of things. Can you, in your own mind, envision this really being turned around? Can you envision a time down the way in which we would talk about how we almost lost it, but in fact we turned it around? And if you can, have you ever talked to other people about that in your same tribe?
Yeah.
And has anybody told a likely story of how that happened? Is it written down anywhere? So I want to know personally, can you really in your gut say, you know, 30, 40, 50 years from now, I can picture us, it used to be going this direction,
right.
Now it's going this direction. Here's how it happened, and here's why the people who had been addicted to this gave up their addiction.
Right. Well, it depends a little bit on what you mean by turns around.
Well,
but yes, no, I can imagine that. No, I don't think. I don't think it's a hopeless argument at all. I think liberalism is in crisis, although it may not know that.
Right. That was the crux of your book. Your book really laid out how its internal inconsistencies, right, both economically and philosophically,
that's right,
are gutting. So I wanted to.
Yeah, and I mean, Obama thought in his own way that it was in crisis when he ran in 2008. He thought that liberalism was a dying faith, and that Bill Clinton had fallen far short of what he could have done or should have done under the circumstances. When he did, I mean, if you think back to the 1990s, Clinton had a booming economy for most of his 2 terms. No foreign wars to speak of, except the adventure in the Balkans that we got into, and yet he was not able to use all of those propitious circumstances to enact national health care. His version, Hillary Care, failed with the Democratic Congress. I mean, he was not defeated by Republicans. He was in effect defeated by his own party in the first 2 years of his first term. But anyway, Obama really thought that progressives' faith in progress and liberals' faith in liberalism was crumbling, and that they had accommodated themselves to a more conservative world, a post-Reagan world, and that there was no getting out, and that he thought that the lesson the Democrats learned from Clinton 1 and 2, I mean the first and second term, not Mr. and Mrs., was that there was no going back to the Great Society or to the New Deal. That kind of aggressive, across-the-board, rapid liberal activism and political breakthrough was a thing of the past. It was all going to be small ball and school uniforms and midnight basketball and all of the little policies that Clinton managed to squeak out in his second term. But Obama thought that Clinton was wrong about that. He thought that he could revive liberalism, that it could return to the aggressive policy, the aggressive pusher of policies, and really the center of American political life that it had been in the 1960s and in the 1930s. And he took fantastic risks in his first term. I don't want to say ignoring, and that he wouldn't agree to that, but putting the issues of the economy and jobs on the back burner so that he could enact Obamacare and Dodd-Frank and the stimulus, which, although it was supposed to affect the economy, really was designed to bail out, public employee unions. I mean, that's the biggest chunk of it. But it was a long game, and he took the risk that he could do something which he thought would be great, and which no one in 100 years had been able to do, namely bring nationalized health care to the United States, finally. This was the holy grail that FDR was not able to do, Truman was not able to do, Kennedy, even Johnson was not able to do it. I mean, Johnson was able to provide national health care for old people and poor people, Medicare and Medicaid, but not for everyone. Obamacare does everyone. It's a 100% solution for a problem that is 8% maybe of the economy, or of the people, I mean. So anyway, he took a huge risk, but he succeeded, and he thinks, I can almost guarantee you that to this very day, if you ask him, he thinks he has saved liberalism and revived it again, and now that it's in the driver's seat once more.
And he got reelected.
And he got reelected, which was a close call. I mean, it was actually a pretty close call. But I think what he doesn't quite understand, or at least he has not acknowledged, is that the real crisis of liberalism is just beginning. I mean, he thinks he's solved that crisis, but I think he's really only at the edge of it. And that crisis is partly fiscal. Like Mrs. Thatcher once famously said, you know, the problem with socialism is you run out of other people's money. We've run out of other people's money. And the government is broke. And our healthcare programs especially are broke. And his solution to 2 healthcare programs that are going broke, Medicare and Medicaid, is to add a 3rd. It's a little counterintuitive, you say at least. But anyway, and the other reason for the crisis of liberalism is really philosophical, I think. It's less obvious but more deadly. And increasingly liberals, especially in the academy, who are an early indicator of where liberalism is going in many cases, don't believe in liberalism anymore. I mean, they don't believe that it's true, or that it's right, or that it's just. And why not? Because they don't believe there's such a thing as truth, or justice, or righteousness. Those are value judgments.
There you go.
They're part of cultures, they're part of history, but they can't be true. And therefore, you know, liberalism, and mostly this is still avant-garde liberalism, but look, it affects Obama. The rug is being pulled out from under their own arguments, because they don't increasingly really think it's true. They just think it's their preference. And so they have to impose it, because they can't really persuade people to something they don't believe themselves. And so, you know, you may have noticed that liberalism seems more and more authoritarian, whether it's sodas in New York, or contraceptives for Catholic institutions of various kinds. I mean, liberalism used to talk about, you know, freedom. Now it talks about, now it insists on conformity, and on, you know, with a heavy hand in forcing people to live the way it thinks you ought to live. And I think that contradiction is going to be very difficult for liberalism, and it'll be good for conservatives, their problems. But the fact that they have problems doesn't mean that we will win. Our politicians, I think I said this, are almost as remiss as liberals in not regarding the Constitution as their business. And they, like, we've been taught this by the Supreme Court, that the final decision on all issues of constitutionality rests with the court. It does in the case in front of them. But there's nothing in the nature of the American system that says, and there are many examples quite to the contrary, that the people at large, that their president, that their elected officials have to regard every Supreme Court decision as instantly settling every issue. Because if they did, Dred Scott would still be the law of the land. Lincoln and the Republicans refused to accept Dred Scott as the political rule going forward. And so they maintained that slavery should be contained, even though the Supreme Court had just said you can't contain it constitutionally, because they said the court was wrong. in its interpretation of the Constitution. And look, it's almost purely a matter of intellectual illumination. I mean, our politicians have to study these issues, as we do, as citizens, and get the courage as well as the wisdom to make these kinds of arguments, and not to accept it when Nancy Pelosi, in her other, or at least one other of her infamous statements, when asked, you know, where's the authority in the Constitution for Obamacare? You know, she famously responded, "Are you kidding? Are you kidding?" I mean, as though she had never been asked that question, never thought about that question, and that anyone who would raise it was such an obvious ignoramus that they, you know, had no business being in American politics. Well, we've got to answer her, and we've got to insist that our guys and gals take it to them on those questions, and it's not that difficult, really. And I think I'm very confident, actually, that our next generation of political leaders is much better than the current one. This was my impression, at least, of the two national conventions, if you watched them last year. I thought the young people on speaking for the Dems were ordinary, dull, uninspiring, and that our younger ones, from Marco Rubio to Martina, what's her name in New Mexico, Suzanne Martinez, and Ted Cruz and others, very smart, very capable, and I'm optimistic. We've got some very good young conservatives coming up now.
Yeah, very nice.
Oh, sorry, the woman behind
My question's a follow-up on Nancy Pelosi's comment, because, you know, the old Supreme Court case that caused the court packing and everything was on the very problem of creating an agency to represent Congress to the public and then take over all that power, which is what we now have because we reversed everything that they came up with. Is she indicative of the way Congress now thinks about the agencies it's created? They're all little kings and dictators, or is there going to be somebody in there to convince them to control those people?
No, they don't think they're kings and dictators. They think they're experts.
Oh, well, that's the same.
Whose wisdom, you know, authorizes them to rule almost with very little oversight.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, I mean, most of those agencies are living violations of the separation of powers because they combine, you know, legislative, executive, and even judicial powers in the same set of hands. Now, but as I was saying, the problem is we may not be able, certainly not soon, to undo that. But at least we can say no more unconstitutional agencies. Let's work with the ones we have and try to reform them, but we don't need to add all of those 136, 56, I've forgotten the number, Obamacare's new bureaus and agencies that are going to be created, every one of which, to some degree, has these problems of uncontrollability and undemocratic power.
Is that 2/3 of the whole cost?
Pardon?
Is that about 2/3 of the total cost, is all those bureaucrats?
It's actually probably much less than that. But it's really, the big costs are going to be covering people on Medicaid, the extension of, you know, many millions of new people onto the Medicaid rolls. But it's really the cost and freedom that we should be particularly objecting to. And the cost and freedom are, I think, enormous.
I really think that the Republicans and the Tea Party ought to speak to the people of America. This is what this is doing to you at your dinner table, in your driveway when you're washing your car, and so on.
No, I couldn't agree more. And but it goes, I mean, you're right to mention the Bill of Rights, but I think that point really goes back to Keith's point. It's really the Declaration of Independence and the notion of individual rights, that is, natural rights. And unfortunately, you know, liberalism in the beginning at the turn of the century, but more particularly in the New Deal, decided to amend the nature of rights in American politics and replace individuals with groups. That's what the so-called Second Bill of Rights, which Roosevelt proposed in 1944, was really about. Those were rights like the right to a job, the right to a vacation from the job, the right to health care, the right to a home, all of which he laid out in that annual message. And those are, the traditional civil rights based on natural rights, the kind of rights you find in the Bill of Rights, are rights essentially, not all of them exactly, but most of them are rights to be left alone. A right to be defended against murderers, trespassers, thieves, people who don't keep their contracts, and government itself, all of which can threaten your rights. The new rights come from government. They're not individual rights. They're gifts of government, and they're necessarily social. And so, the attitude of modern liberalism is the more power you give government, the more rights it will give you. And that's proven to be a very seductive proposition.
Which is the opposite.
Yeah.
So how did we go from the 90s where a Democrat legislature said no to universal health care to now where not only are most of the Democrats in Congress progressives, but now we also have voters who are willing to vote, back in a guy who ran up $6 trillion in debt and, seems to, not care about the Constitution one little bit. So how did we go from that in the mid-90s to where we are today in such a short period of time?
It's a complicated question, but one simple way to think about it is that in 1992, 1993, we were much closer to Reagan and to his influence on our politics than we were in 2009, 2010. And the spirit of Reagan was very strong, and it was strong even among the Democrats. I mean, they had lost elections enormously in 1984, and even Bush's victory in 1988 was fairly comfortable, Bush the first. And so they were running scared, I think, is part of the answer. The other part of the answer, though, is that there's a big difference between Clinton and Obama. I mean, Obama is a much more ideological, much more really, left-wing liberal than Clinton was. I mean, Clinton, remember, was the head of the Democratic Leadership Council. He was the head of the centrist Democrats. And he believed in his heart that the Democrats had to move to the center if they were to survive, if they were to stop losing by such big margins. And so he introduced NAFTA, and he moderated a lot of the economic and social positions of the Dems. I mean, he's the one who said that abortion should be safe, legal, and rare. You haven't heard Barack Obama say rare. And you'll never hear Barack Obama say the era of big government is over, because he thinks it's just begun. The age to come is the age of bigger government. And he really believes that.
I think people will now, when they see what happens with Barack Obama, by not being a centrist, obviously it would be hard to get things done. And that's Clinton goes to the middle, he's a diplomat, he gets things done. So Barack won't get things done, number one. And number two, people I think will start to see the loss of their freedom. Now they think they're going to get freedom. The rich guy's been the one, he did it that was a smart thing to do, is say the rich people, the ones keeping us down, because it's a small percentage. But now that we see the truth, that that's not going to help things for them, I think it can start to turn around.
Yes, no, I think, I hope you're right, and it seems to me that it's a reasonable expectation. I mean, you can't, as Lincoln said, you can't fool all the people all the time. But unfortunately, it's too late in some respects. I mean, he's been reelected, and Obamacare is law, Dodd-Frank is law, and so forth. But these things can change, and we should be hopeful. I mean, after all, as I said in this piece in National Review, we should remind ourselves twice daily, the Soviet Union is no more. And that should cheer us up. Thank you, Professor Kesler, and thank you everyone for coming.